Okay, so we left it at the point where we were using the B setting, so the unorthodox set for a lead hand strike, which is close. And if you do that posture and then you start breaking it down slowly, it will occur to you that, well, that's the orthodox A setting for a rear hand strike. So what is the B setting for a lead hand strike is the A setting for the rear hand strike. So you would normally use close for a rear hand strike, that's its A setting, but if you use close for a lead hand strike, that's the B setting. So this is part of the way Yiquan works, the way these things are structurally integrated right across the curriculum. And this is something you will particularly feel if you just break it down into the pre-movement, so there's not even a technique involved. It's just the pre-movement, and that could form itself into a lead hand technique or a rear hand technique. And think about that very abstract idea that Wang Xiangjai talks about, that there's form and yet there's not form. So there's form and no form simultaneously. It's a kind of pre-movement. The potential for the technique is in the pre-movement. And it should just form as the intent triggers the crystallization into a specific technique or lock point in the moment. And although it sounds a little bit abstract, one of the really important things that the intent does is skew the posture so that most of the force goes to one particular point. So it really does matter from the pre-movement whether you decide to do a lead hand posture with B setting, i.e. close, or a rear hand posture with A setting, i.e. close. Because even though they might look identical to an onlooker, nevertheless they are stacked differently. The intent, which is the only thing that's fast enough to do this intuitively in the moment, the intent will skew the posture slightly towards one or the other. It will make lots of different micro adjustments within the well, let's say the internal structure of the body. And it will also do lots of other little things. It's got lots of other little tricks it can do, like to emphasize a lead hand posture with unorthodox B setting. You can use a little bit of stone cracking root, so you lift up the lead heel and just crack it down, and that'll give you a little bit of extra power, but you wouldn't do that usually with a rear hand posture. But these decisions have got to be made so fast in the heat of the moment that you can't do them consciously. It's got to be what in China they call thinking skin. And so this particularly is a useful little trick to learn, particularly for push hands where we're usually using the B settings because we're pushing and we want to brace. So we're trying to get every little bit of force we can into the posture. So using a little extra hard set on the lead foot, adding a little bit of this little stone cracking set, just adds that extra little bit of zing into a posture. Very useful, sneaky little trick. Keep that in mind, we'll come back to it later. For now, we want to change and look at this rear hand sweeping the bell on the spot. So it's using close, so you can see it's using the pivot root from the rear foot, articulated force from the rear hand, and the screwing force and oppositional force from the lead hand. And we also want to get this movement of the chest, this shimmy of the shoulders that adds extra phase and therefore extra volume into the posture, because it's a short movement. We want to absolutely maximize power, and that short movement, that little shimmy of the shoulders really helps to do that. And following our practice of escalating the basics, we want to move up a level now to think about hit and flow. So we hit the lock point, we don't just stop there, we flow, continue on with the flow of the movement back into the guard posture. But within all of that, notice the change of intent. So visualize, think about why this is important, that you have to visualize where you're hitting and why. So you're hitting out with the rear arm, and that allows the intent to then take over the movement and just skew the posture so that it's distributing more force towards that hit point. The skew of the posture is first and foremost in the mind. Visualizing the hit changes the way the posture is stacked. in terms of stepping with this posture, there's lots of different options and they all have different implications depending on how you use rooting. And the first consideration is that if a posture uses too much close, then the posture becomes much more unbalanced. However, one of the things that we've been learning is that we can change between different considerations, so we can emphasize different things, different quintessence principles of wushu, strength over explosive force, one context over another. Well, we can also change the emphasis on the rooting that we use depending on the length or size of a step or movement. And the main reason we want to do that is that shorter movements are less powerful, so we want to hard set them with both feet if possible. So we do a hard set on the rear foot instead of a pivot root, and you can feel that intuitively in your body that makes the posture much stronger in a short sharp step. And we don't want to do this posture in a way that damages the leg, so essentially we're releasing force into the ground with the rear foot, so we don't want the foot pointing outwards. So we turn it in, and that allows us to slide it forwards very much like Yiquan, and then just hard set it on the ground. Makes the posture unbalanced for a split second, but it maximizes force. We've made a compromise. And generally speaking, the rule is for a very short, really micro movement posture, you don't need to turn the foot forward at all. And then for a kind of mid-range in between micro and macro step, you just turn in the foot a bit as you step forward, and then we're going to eventually move to a macro step where we use a full pivot root, and then the foot will be pointing completely forwards. But for those micro and mid-range steps, we're going to emphasize force transmission rather than balance. And recall that it's more unbalanced because it's more double weighted. But if we try to do that with a bigger, more dynamic step, we're going to get a lot of problems because our own force will be too much for us to balance with that narrow posture. So we change instead to the pivot root. And this is going to be over-determined because using the pivot root in the first place is structurally sympathetic with pushing us forward off the rear foot. So springing forward, and then we kick back. So it's called kickback rooting. We kick back and push into the floor with the ball of the foot. And that also is going to help just lock the posture into the ground. I mean, that's the ideal scenario, but I'm training on very slippy ground here, so I was experiencing some slip back from the pivot roots, particularly the rear pivot root. So you eventually learn how to adapt your rooting to the ground you're on, and you might feel intuitively that because it's slippy, you want to do shorter steps with flatter rooting. That's just something to keep in mind, but it's getting a bit ahead of ourselves here. And the next consideration is that when we do this posture, it allows you to use rise in a way that the flat-footed posture doesn't. Rise and then sink. So for a narrow movement, very short movement like that, you're just using close, so using one context, and you're adding extra force in it by using the harder set. Then it's one posture on a very short, sharp count of one using one context. But we can change that with the pivot root. So as we move in, first of all, we use close. But at the same time, we're lifting up, so we're compounding with rise. And then at the end, we land and sink. So this is what we call chaining the contexts. They're not all being merged at the same time. We're using close and rise and then dropping down into sink, a chained context. And when we drop down into sink, we can use the compression set to add more solidity to the overall consistency of our structure. And then just notice and keep in mind the finer details of the rear foot. So when we do a flat foot short step, the knee is pointing out to the side while the hip is pointing in. So it's closed with a compromise with the rear foot to balance, make it a little bit more of a balanced posture. But when we change to do the bigger step and the pivot root, we can't just turn the foot out so that it points towards the hip point. For the simple reason it would be going too far in the opposite direction of the hip. Hip is going in, foot would be pointing out, and that would be quite a damaging posture, or possibly could be. So we modify our usual rule of the foot pointing towards the hip point and just say, well, it goes as far as it possibly can to be safe.